Time for the witchcraft kids to go absolutely feral.
Hello everyone, welcome back to Meddling in Antiquity. My name is Teray, and today on our episode of Serial Scrutiny, we're going to be talking about Susanna Clarke's Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell. Before we kind of launch into analyzing the show, I want to give a brief overview of what the show is about, when it takes place, give you an idea of the setting that we're going to be exploring. So the show takes place in England, specifically kind of going back and forth between London and all the places where the major battles of the Napoleonic Wars take place, because the show takes place in a 10-year gap between 1817 and 1828. And it kind of focuses on these two characters, Jonathan Strange, played by Bertie Carvel, and Mr. Norrell, played by Eddie Marsan. And it focuses on their interactions and both of their experiences in regards to the return of magic to England after 300 years. And there's also kind of a third character that is involved in that interplay, and that is the Raven King. But the interesting thing about the Raven King is you never actually see him in person until the very final episode of the show, which is a very interesting way to kind of have such an important key character involved in a narrative without actually introducing that character until it is 100% truly madly relevant, which I really think was a very good play. And it is based on a book. The book was written in 2004, and there is also a companion series called Ladies of Grace Adieu and Other Stories that was released in 2005. And unfortunately, Susanna Clarke, the author of Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, has not released another book yet. However, on September 25th, she will be coming out with her second full-length novel, Piranesi. So go pre-order that right now. It's gonna be amazing. I already know. Now that I've kind of given you an idea of who and where and what we're dealing with, let's get into the magic of it. Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell is a show that's really interesting to me for a couple reasons. The first one is that it's a series adapted from a book that is written almost like a textbook. The interesting thing with Clarke's writing of the book is that a lot of the pages include footnotes. As you can see right here, there is these places where it's all footnoted. That's an entire footnote. And the thing I love about that is that it shows she not only created the initial subject matter for the novel, but she also created alternative source materials that she references throughout the novel without actually having those materials exist, which I think is really admirable and shows exactly how much care she put into the book. And the thing that made me really enjoy the series is that despite the fact that they couldn't put every single little detail from the book into the series, they managed to fit most of them in, which shows that the people who were making this show also really cared about what they were trying to make by making it as close to the book as they could get it. And they did a phenomenal job, especially using minimal special effects for all the magic. Now kind of getting into the magic of the show. So the show, like I said, takes place in England in the early 1800s during the Napoleonic Wars. So it's interesting to kind of see exactly how they play with the magic. And one of the things I really like about the show is that the people who created it had a special effects budget that was a pretty decent sized special effects budget, but their goal was to, when they used the special effects, to make them as impactful as possible. So there's not a lot of places where you see these major big green screen things. So as opposed to something like the Harry Potter series where there's constant SFX work and there's constant green screening, with Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, it's all done in a very practical application. And my favorite one, and I'm gonna link the clip up in the end card, is the sand horses, which is a very funny scene that shows you exactly what kind of person Jonathan is. And I think it's a really fun way to introduce yourself to the series and introduce yourself to these characters and how interesting and fun this world is to be in and to play in and to sandbox in. So now that I've kind of explained the magic that's in the show and how that's done, I want to kind of get into the relationships and the issues surrounding those relationships that happen within the text and in the show. Starting off our relationship segment, I want to first focus on probably one of the people who has the most interesting character development arc and is probably one of the most interesting characters in the show to me, Stephen Black, played by Arion Bakare, who all the Good Omens fans out there will know as Liger, Lord of Hell. So Stephen's character, it presents an interesting dilemma to the other characters in the show and how they interact with him, because Stephen is black. Stephen is a black man living in an extremely white world as a paid servant in a time where most people who were as dark as him were still slaves. And Stephen's relationships play out in a very interesting way because as Stephen is a black man, he is always seen as the other, not just in England itself, but in Fairy as well. And it's a very interesting way of how that plays out. So the first relationship I wanted to get into is Stephen and his employer, Walter Pole. So Walter Pole's is a member of parliament, and his father was previously involved in the slave trade and owned the ship on which Stephen was born, and his mother died giving birth to him. So Stephen's history with the Pole family is a bit complicated, but Walter Pole's father took Stephen in and had him trained as a servant instead of having him as a slave, because by that point the slave trade had been, I believe, abolished in England. But Stephen was trained as a slave. He can read, he can write, he can do a lot of things that people don't associate with someone of his skin color being able to do in that time, considering that this show starts, the first time we meet Stephen is in 1817. And Stephen, his relationship with Walter Pole is very complicated because Walter sees him as a friend, but there's really nothing outside of that because Stephen is a servant. Stephen is still below him regardless of how they were raised when they were children. And that also kind of plays into how Stephen is viewed in society, because to Walter Pole, Stephen is other because he's a servant. It has nothing to do with his race. To society, to the people around Stephen, or the general populace around Stephen, Stephen is other because he's a servant and he's black. So that creates another, like, a level of that otherness against Stephen because he's a lower class and he's a different color. And then getting into Stephen's relationship with one of our story's villains, the gentleman with the thistledown hair, played by Mark Warren, who all the Musketeers fans out there will know as Rochefort, the biggest bastard in season 2. So the gentleman's relationship with Stephen is one where the gentleman sees Stephen as other to society because of his race, but also he's other to Fairy because he is a human, and also because of his race. Because the interesting thing that you see in the scenes where Stephen and the gentleman are in Fairy, Stephen is the only black person in Fairy too. So it's very much, these levels are stacking up against him in a way that makes it really difficult for Stephen to see himself as having a place anywhere. And I think that adds a very interesting depth to his character because there's this generational trauma of having been involved in the slave trade, but then there's also the trauma of dealing with a society that doesn't respect him simply because he's a lower class or because of the color of his skin. And that's, I think, a really cool thing that they tackle throughout the show and eventually is resolved when Steven in the very end finds his place, and it is a giant spoiler, so I'm not going to say it. But that kind of wraps up talking about Steven, and now I want to get into the ladies, specifically our main character, Jonathan, and his relationship with his wife, Arabella. Getting to the ladies of Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, we have two major female characters who play a hugely important part in the plot. We have Emma Pohl, who is Walter Pohl's wife, and we have Arabella Strange, Jonathan Strange's wife. And the interesting thing about these characters is that the two of them have a very close bond that forms throughout the course of the show that is also a very important part of the show. Though the most notable thing about both of them that I really enjoy is that Arabella is a character who is allowed to be a female character who is written and in the show is portrayed to be very strong and fiercely independent, despite the fact that her and Jonathan have a very loving relationship, and Emma is constantly allowed to be angry at the world without being vilified for being so. And most notably, Emma's circumstances through the show, which I cannot mention because it is again a massive spoiler to the plot. It is a massive issue in the plot. But her problems are all caused by Mr. Norrell. And she actively hates him and openly talks about how much she hates and despises him for doing what he does to her. And she's not vilified for it by anyone outside of the person who's guilty. The only person who vilifies her for doing so is Mr. Norrell. And it's so refreshing to see a woman in a period piece like this that takes place during this time who is allowed to be so ungodly angry at her circumstances and to so harshly rebel against them. It's really fun to see, and it turns Emma from this very delicate, shrinking Violet character into this angry badass of a woman by the end of the show. And it's a transformation that I really appreciated seeing done so well. And Arabella, Jonathan's wife, I can't even really talk about the two of them separately because their relationship is one that is so strong and so fun to see in the show. And I think the best way I can put it is that Jonathan may be the man, Arabella may have his last name, but who wears the pants in this relationship? Arabella. 100%. Jonathan will kowtow to that woman to the ends of the earth and would do anything to make her happy. He loves Arabella so much. And it's so fun to see because there's a scene that's not in the show. It's in Ladies of Grace Adieu. Which has not been adapted, unfortunately. I would love to see Ladies of Grace Adieu done as like a little mini spin-off show, like a mini series at some point. Created BBC, hit me up. I will direct. I will adapt. Let's do this. But there's a scene in the very first story, the title story, Ladies of Grace Adieu, that takes place when Jonathan and Arabella are visiting Arabella's brother, Henry, at his new parish. And it's this really fun scene where they're driving into town and there are these ladies who are walking and they see them in their carriage. And the specific thing that's pointed out is that the carriage is not being driven by Jonathan. Nay. Arabella's driving the carriage. So you've got Arabella in her fine dress driving the carriage, and Jonathan, quite literally, it describes him as reclining next to her. He's just chilling. He's letting his wife drive. He's like, I am incapable of having the attention span to drive for long periods of time, so I'm gonna let my wife do it. And it shows that their relationship isn't restrictive. Jonathan loves Arabella enough to let her do whatever she wants. And it's so fun to see that, because their relationship is fun. It's fun to watch that kind of relationship done so well. And Arabella's character kind of is always consistently very strong, very steadfast, and very much centered in herself. And I think that's a really fun thing to see, because Arabella, she never lets her emotions get the better of her. And when she does, it's always for the best of reasons. So her and Emma are kind of opposite sides of the same coin, which is why they get along so well in the show. And it's a friendship that I really appreciate, and relationship that I really appreciate between Arabella and Jonathan, because their relationship is just, there's so much love there, and there's a lot of love between Arabella and Emma as well. So now that I've kind of gone through the relationships and a bit of the politics that are involved in it, I think we're ready to jump into final thoughts and wrapping it up. To wrap up Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, if you're a historical fiction fan, if you're a period piece fan, if you like magic or all three, any combination of the two, you're going to enjoy this show. It's so well casted, and I do really recommend reading the book. I really do. It's very long, but I do recommend reading it, because the writing, if you want an idea of how good the writing is, Susanna Clarke was actually mentored by Neil Gaiman. Yeah, that Neil Gaiman. Yeah, you're thinking of the right Neil. Yeah. So the writing in the book is incredible, and it translates so well to screen that the details that are in the book that they couldn't manage to slip into 7 episodes of the miniseries, I don't miss them. Reading the book, watching the series, and then rereading the book and rewatching the show all the way through, it's how they fitted everything in is so seamless that those details that you miss that are in the book that you miss in the show don't really matter, because the only things they took are the things that they absolutely needed, and they didn't have to modify much to make it fit for television. And the care that was put into creating the show is incredible. The casting is amazing. It's incredible. Everyone fits their characters so well, and I really couldn't have asked for a better cast, even if it is Mark Warren playing a villain in a BBC show again. But it's an amazing show. I really do recommend it. Check out the book, check out Ladies of Grace Adieu, the companion series, and pre-order Susanna Clarke's novel Piranesi when it comes out September 25th, 2020. And I think that's it. So I will see you all tomorrow for our next episode of Sociopolitical Smackdown.